Hello everyone, welcome to this video. So if you have an interest in Eurofly 3, maybe you keep an eye on it as you play other mainstream sims like MSFS and P3D, or maybe you play Eurofly 2 pretty extensively. So you've really been excited for this. You may have seen that Eurofly 3 got a demo video today in English published, which allowed us to see the full presentation of a flight. And so as I was watching it, I went through and made some notes, and I thought we would go through kind of what I think about it. I guess from the perspective of someone who currently plays mainstream simulators, as I say, like Lockheed Martin Prepared and Microsoft Flight Simulator. Not, I should add, to compare them, but just so that I can kind of use that knowledge to talk to you about kind of what I think has really been improved in Eurofly 3, what I think is still kind of unrealistic. And I guess to answer the question of if you have transitioned away from Eurofly 2 because as I did, because it was just too unrealistic, and once I played these mainstream simulators, it was just too much. To go back to Eurofly 2, is it worth going back and taking a look at Eurofly 3 now if you're one of those people? So a couple of caveats, I guess. As I said, I'm not trying to compare something like Microsoft with Eurofly. I think that would be frankly ridiculous. Microsoft is a platform that's been around for decades with pretty much infinite resources and infinite numbers of people working on it. Eurofly, although the team has slightly expanded, is still a very small team. It's totally free. It's an audio game, so some features, or some items that you might expect to see in a real flight simulator have had to be slightly adapted because it is an audio game. So some things will be different. I'm not trying to compare them, and I think if you come into looking at Eurofly 3 with the attitude of, is it the same as Microsoft Flight Simulator and will it give me the same levels of realism, then you're always going to have a pretty negative attitude towards it. If you come into it looking at it as, okay, can this help develop people's knowledge of aviation, so that maybe they could even come into mainstream simulators with a lot of knowledge from Eurofly 3, and also could it act as a really fun way for people to share their love for their hobby of aviation, then I think you get a much different answer, and that's kind of the perspective that I would try and take with it. So a couple other caveats. I did do some work on Eurofly 3 maybe a year or two ago, gathering data for all the various aircraft in terms of some basics, what systems they have, what flat positions, do they have retractable gear, do they have reverse thrusters, do they have specific autopilot systems, but also the stuff to do with the physics, so like drag ratios and wing areas and that kind of thing that impact the flight model. So I did do that for Stefan. So I guess I do have some of an interest in Eurofly 3 in terms of having done a bit of work on it, but it was quite a while ago, and as you know, my kind of level of interest in Eurofly has been very limited with Eurofly 2. So it's not like I'm some kind of Eurofly fanboy, really. I think you probably know, if you've watched the channel, that I have very much gravitated toward mainstream sims, and so I think that's one caveat. And the other thing is, we've got to give a lot of respect to Stefan for what he's been able to do here. I think he's done a pretty good job with what he's got at his disposal. I think you got to give some respect for the demo that I believe Lucas was the gentleman's name, did. It was quite a nice demo with a lot of info packed into it, with the level of expectation that this community has, it can be easy to slate something like Eurofly, but at the end of the day, what you've also got to remember is this is not easy. If it was easy, everybody would be doing this kind of thing. And you've only got to take one look at the Eurofly mailing list to see that everybody and their dog's got a feature list as long as their arm of what they'd like to see, but nobody's actually willing to put in the work to implement those things necessarily. So it's easy for even me to sit here and say, oh, this is wrong, and maybe it is, but it's a lot more difficult to actually go and change it, or as they say, well, if you don't like it, go and make your own. So I think in this case, obviously, if you don't like the levels of realism of even Eurofly 3, you can go to a mainstream sim, and so you can get the extra system depth there, and so there is that option there. But considering this is free, and that's one thing I'm always loath to criticize it because it's free, so they're not really criticisms, they're more just observations, good and bad. Because it's free, it's a great option, and as I say, hopefully it'll act as a great pathway into the mainstream sims, and hopefully it'll allow us all to share our love for aviation. And so I guess one of the questions we're trying to answer is it worth even taking a look at if you're in the mainstream sims? I think to an extent maybe it is, but let's have a look. So I made some notes as I was watching the demo of things that I liked and things that I didn't. So one of the things to note is I believe the gentleman said that there was 150 aircraft in Eurofly, which I can believe because most of them I had to get the data for and it took forever. That means they're not modelled particularly well in terms of system depth. Now, if you're coming from Eurofly 2 and you don't know much about aviation, you're probably thinking, what the hell are you talking about? Eurofly 3 seems eminently more complicated than Eurofly 2. If you're coming at this from a Microsoft perspective and you know more about aviation, then you'll understand what I'm saying. A lot of the systems are quite generic. So if you fly an A320 and you fly 737, the flight model will be slightly different, the way the aircraft feels and responds, but the systems will be pretty similar. So if you're using automatic navigation in one aircraft, automatic navigation will function the same in other aircraft. Same with a lot of the other autopilot modes and things like that. Okay, so obviously different aircraft will have different autopilot modes, but what I'm saying is if you find the same autopilot mode in multiple aircraft, it will function in the same way. Same thing with this quite primitive idea of turning on a computer, right? A real aircraft will have many computers, usually 3 FMC units linked up to various computers, and it won't just be a case of walking into a cockpit and flicking on a computer and being like, that's the computer system on. So system depth, obviously there are various things. If we take the example and follow that with the A320, 737, obviously maybe we don't all know, but I apologize if I'm using a lot of aviation terms that you may not understand. Google is probably your friend because I can't explain everything, but we know, for example, that an A320 has fly-by-wire flight control technology, whereas the 737 has the more manual flight controls. We know that, for example, an A320 has different approach mode logic to the 737. We know that the A320 handles differently in terms of the way that it feels to hand fly, not only in terms of the physics, but it as I say, the fly-by-wire technology makes it handle slightly differently. If you point the flight controls in a certain direction, they will stay there, whereas a Boeing, it's always going to return to neutral with the yoke position anyway, and you're going to have to kind of fight the aircraft a lot more, or at least sort of, it's a more manual handling. So there are differences, and they're not always going to be modelled. Now, that's not even a negative really in my book to an extent, because there's, as I say, 150 aircraft. It would not be feasible for Stefan to model each aircraft and its unique specificities. You would need input from real world pilots, you would need years and years, you'd need a much more advanced team. It would probably become a payware project. The reason that Microsoft and other simulators do have such in-depth simulations is because they're done by third-party developers most of the time, right? Microsoft is the platform, PMDG for the 737 is the add-on developer, TFM is an add-on, right? Eurofly is not only an audio game, but it is the platform. So, to expect the aircraft to be simulated in massive depth is probably not realistic. It would be nice, undoubtedly, as we go forward, to see some of the differences modelled. Maybe some of the computer interfaces could be slightly different. Obviously, in real world, they're not called quote computer unquote, but maybe they could become slightly different. Maybe some of the kind of system depth could be improved. That being said, some of the systems are there to an extent, and so let's kind of explore that a little bit more. But the takeaway from that is the flight models of each aircraft will be different. The systems, to an extent, will be somewhat generic and kind of just inputted into the different aircraft. One thing I saw that I was really happy to find and was quite surprised about was that the aircraft condition will degrade as you fly it over time, and also that if you crash it, of course, it will degrade even further. So you might experience system failures. This was quite nice. You can actually go ahead and do a system check. So you didn't realize that they were going to have this kind of system in place where things would degrade, and that's really cool to see, actually. Right, so let's go on to the flap positions. So each aircraft now does have a certain number of flap positions as per the real world counterpart. It is a little bit binary still, in that there's a set value that says, okay, you have to have this minimum flap position for takeoff and this maximum minimum flap position for landing. So that is kind of per the real world. It's not always the case that there's a firm set limit as to this is your minimum takeoff flap, for example. It is kind of dependent on aircraft weight, but because it had to be somewhat binary when I was creating the aircraft, the way I did it was kind of put the, for example, in the 737, theoretically you could take off with flaps at position 1 in real life if you were particularly light and in a smaller variant of the 737. It's not normally done, but it can be done. The default variant for the default position for the 737 is 5 degrees of flap, which is position 3. So this is another thing to note. All the aircraft have flap positions, but not necessarily degree notations. So in the real world, a lot of aircraft, so Boeing in particular, do it by degrees. So the 737 has flaps 1 degree, 2, 5, 10, 15, 25, 30, and 40. So if you were calling for flaps full in the 737 in real life, you'd say flaps 40. You wouldn't say flaps position 8 or whatever it would be. So in an Airbus, you would. So in an Airbus, they are called flap positions, but in a lot of other aircraft, McDonnell Douglas and Boeing, etc., they are degrees. Eurofly seems to have adopted the Airbus approach across the board, and every aircraft is position 1, 2, 3, 4, blah, blah, blah. So that's, not ideal, but absolutely fine. I mean, it's not the end of the world, I suppose. I mean, you're still getting the idea of having to consider where your flaps are at. And we'll go into a bit more detail about that. Let's go into some of the systems that are in here. So the APU is now modeled. So you do have to actually start the APU to then be able to provide power to the aircraft, to then go ahead and perform an engine start, for example, or just other systems. So the way that it was done in this demo was the battery switch had to be turned on, and then you could go ahead and fire up the APU if you wanted to. That is somewhat realistic. Normally in real life, you'd probably start out with a ground power unit, which is ground power provided by the airport, and then you transition over to the APU before you go ahead and perform the pushback. There didn't seem to be really a ground power unit per se. It was more just that you turn the battery on and then fired up the APU. I mean, that's fine. You can, some aircraft, or specific airlines, standard operating procedures will do that, where they might not use ground power at a certain airport, or it might not be available. So they just perform an APU start and that's it. So yes, it can happen. But I guess it'd be nice to see the ability to have ground power from the airport as well. And I should note throughout all this is just what I got from the demo, so some of it might be wrong, right? I think the APU start procedure, so it was a little bit simple. Obviously, in the real world, there are more steps to starting an APU than just flicking the switch that starts up the APU. Again, very much aircraft dependent, right? So there are aircraft where it's very automated. There are aircraft where you have to perform a checklist, really, to on various items. But I think it was okay. It maybe started up a little bit quickly. Maybe in the real world it would start up take a little bit longer, but again, it's kind of aircraft dependent, so I guess we can forgive that. There were lights, and there were more significant numbers of lights. So we have taxi lights, strobe lights, landing lights, and they have to be on at the correct times. For example, you've got to have your taxi lights on when you're taxiing, of course, landing, coming in for landing. So that was nice to see, and they've obviously been named correctly. So these systems, there was still this kind of there's a ventilation system, there's a temperature system. That kind of is an amalgamation of various systems from the real world. So there was no pack system. So the packs that you would find in the 737 or something were not kind of modeled, although these systems, as I say, the temperature system, the ventilation, seem to be kind of an amalgamation of various systems all jumbled together. So they're not. It's not necessarily real world that you would say, okay, we're going to turn the ventilation on and we're going to turn temperature on. Um, but again, as I say, these are kind of generic things that are going to be in every aircraft, or at least I would assume the majority of jets that you're gonna find, at least, and unless you're flying some kind of very low flying aircraft, but yeah, so they're not fully realistic, but they are there, and you know again, hopefully they can be improved with some more aircraft specificity going forward. The GPWS, so it does have real world terrain now in Eurofly 3. This is a very nice feature. So I'm assuming the world is mapped out in terms of terrain. It certainly seemed to match for the airports that were being used. It was quite flat, but the airport elevation seemed to match. So I would assume if you're flying into a particularly mountainous region of the world, then that is actually going to be modelled, and that's obviously why there's GPWS. And there are various ways to get around that, but the terrain. But that's really nice to see, actually, and being able to hand fly and things around some terrain, or at least keep looking at the terrain. That's something you don't even get in some of the mainstream sims, right? Really, you're pretty much in the mainstream sim trying to avoid terrain by following published procedures, approaches, and things. You don't really get to navigate around terrain as a kind of a joyride or something. You probably smash into it. You can do your best, but this thing will actually give you the ability to look up the various safe altitudes for the various regions that you'll be flying into. A little note I did make, I'm not sure why the GPWS was going off during the takeoff when you started climbing. In real life, GPWS is smarter than that and would not go off normally during the climb out. It only goes off if it senses you're coming in for a landing and that airport is in the database, or of course if you're too low during a regular flight, flying into terrain, then it would sound, but not normally during the climb out. I also noted that you did have to turn on the stall indication. That's also not really realistic. That wouldn't happen in the real world. Stall protection or stall alerts is just there. Your column will shake or you'll hit an all alert. In real life, you wouldn't kind of have to manually turn on stall alerts, but there you go. So the engine start. The engines did take a little while to start. Now in the video on the 787, the gentleman started both engines at the same time. Now I don't know if that's something you can do in every aircraft on Eurofly. I kind of suspect it might be. I kind of hope it's not, though. So most aircraft, you cannot start both engines at the same time because there's not enough bleed air and things like that being provided. The aircraft does not have enough power to do that. So there are some aircraft where you can do a dual engine start. But the 737, the 320, things like that, you can't do a dual engine start. In terms of the time they took to start, it was relatively realistic. It certainly was better than in 2, where they were just ready in an instant pretty much. Again, the engine start procedure was a bit limited. It was pretty much just flick a switch and they're going to begin the start. Obviously in most aircraft, in most jets in real life, you have to do a bit more than that. You've actually got to watch when you put the fuel in and watch your N1 and N2 values and make sure that they're going up correctly. So that was a bit simplistic. Now there are some aircraft, automated aircraft. The 787 may well be one of them. I've never flown one in the simulator where you can auto start. In fact, I believe it is. Even some aircraft 747, I think newer models have auto start options available. So it's not that unrealistic, but certainly in the aircraft that I would say I'm most familiar with, the 737, you can't do an auto start where you just flick a button and off it goes. Let's talk a little bit about ground operations then. There's a lot more requests you can make to ATC now, and a lot more things you can do. at airports. One thing the gentleman did in the video was call ATC for fuel. Again, in real life, that probably you wouldn't really call ATC for fuel. I think he called the ground control. You would call kind of the maintenance services, or the refueler, the ground handling. Essentially, depends what you want to do. I mean, I think there was an option to call maintenance. There was an option to get fuel. There was an option to request boarding. All of that you'd be talking to the ground handler, really. You wouldn't call ATC for that. But obviously that the ground handling is not necessarily simple. The ground handler is not simulated, so they've just done it through ATC. Again, not entirely realistic, but not necessarily a deal breaker. The timings seem better in terms of the refueling to an extent. So you actually had to have the refueler called, and then they would come to the aircraft. We won't assume the refueler's gender. They would come to the aircraft, and that would take a little while. The actual refueling procedure was pretty much, again, took like 20 seconds, which is not very realistic, but I guess it saves some time. Just pretend it's on instant mode in your GSX or something like that if you do that. But a lot of us also, even in the mainstream simulators, we don't spend forever watching our aircraft get refueled and boarded and all this stuff, because it can take up to an hour or whatever for everything to be done, and it just gets too long sitting around just kind of watching all the outside action and not being able to actually take off. So that wasn't too bad. The frequencies that I was seeing did not seem to be real world. I should add that. I know. I think Heathrow approach was like 113 decimal something. That's certainly not a real world frequency for anything, ATC wise. Anyway, you wouldn't see a 113 frequency. But yeah, so they didn't seem to be real world. But I guess again, if it depends where your standards are at, but it's not too bad. Now the call signs, I have to say something about the call sign, I guess. Again, in real world, this would not be, formatted in SK something, SK 636 or whatever it was. In the real world, would not be a valid call sign or identifier. SK, would not be an identifier. It's normally 3 letters for your call sign identifier, and ATC would also always use the phonetic versions. It would be Sierra Kilo. Not that they would ever have a 2-letter call sign for an airline or a registered air operator, but yeah, they wouldn't be saying SK something. But that's just a minor point from me in terms of that. But as I said, there are a lot more requests you can make to ATC. You do have to call for push. You do have to call if you want to start. So that was quite nice. And there's also a form of kind of IFR clearance in setting up and requesting a flight plan. Now, obviously, no big surprises. Flight plans do not contain real-world waypoints, it seems. So if you're into aviation, you'll know that there's a thing called an ERAC, which is released every month and contains a bunch of thousands and thousands of fixes across the world that are used as navigation points. They can be various beacons. I won't go into too much detail because it's not really relevant, but yeah, various beacons, physical beacons sending out signals, or they can even be just kind of not a physical point, but a point that's been given a name, and that is kind of a coordinate point, and that is a waypoint that you then track to. So that's not been included, which obviously means that things like standard instrument departures or SIDS and STARS, standard terminal arrivals, as you would know them in the real world, the exact kind of procedure that you would be flying, the I don't know, the Kennedy 5 out of Kennedy or something. It's probably not a real one, but whatever, they are not there. What is there is you can either still do a direct flight plan, or you can have a flight plan that seems to consider waypoints, not waypoints as that I'm talking about from the real world, but waypoints such as airports or points on a map. So you might have a flight from East Midlands to Heathrow, and one of the waypoints might be Birmingham, and you go through that way, something like that. They're not necessarily real waypoints from what I could tell. It seemed to be more like these would be waypoints as other airports and things like that would be included on this flight plan to acknowledge at least that the aircraft should not just fly in a straight line normally. It would actually have various fixes that it needs to follow, but obviously in this case they're not real world fixes. But we didn't see that in the demo. We didn't see a full kind of generated flight plan. It was more of a direct flight plan that was chosen. So we didn't fully see that, so I can't really make too much of a comment on that. There does appear to be some kind of, like I say, flight corridors that ATC will send you through as a sort of substitute to the real world, following a SID, then joining a flight plan with various fixes, and then joining a star. So the approaches did seem to have a form of ILS. So it did mention ILS by name. I mean, it didn't seem to be a perfect representation of the ILS. Of course, in real life, the ILS is kind of something that you actually intercept. There's a localizer and a glide slope. It didn't mention that, but it had a form of ILS that was going to guide you into the runway auditorily, if that's even a word. Auditory signals guiding you in. So that is there. I would imagine there's not going to be other kinds of approaches. So, the published charts for the real world have various forms of approaches. ILS approaches, RNAV approaches, NDB, VOR approaches, all these kind of various approaches that you have to fly specific procedures. Normally, if it's quite a primitive, take a VOR approach, it's going to be based around a particular VOR beacon, and then you're going to make a series of turns around this beacon, for example. So it doesn't seem like those are going to be in there, which would make sense because, as I said, there's no real world AIRAC data in there. There's no SIDS and stars, but there was at least mention of an ILS. Now, you didn't get IFR clearances in the real world where you'd be given a SID, an initial altitude and all that kind of thing. But they did accept the flight plan and give a transponder code. So it seemed as though the transponder code that was given would actually stay for the whole flight. So that's good that it's not going to change every time you go into a different airspace. And so once you've created your flight plan, they'll accept it or whatever. And so it's not a full IFR clearance, but it's some form of an acknowledgement that you have to get a clearance from ATC on your specific flight plan, and that's the route that you've then been cleared on. Phraseology for things like the engine start and things were not perfect, but it certainly does the job. It was obviously kind of generic phraseology that was not going to be changing depending on what region of the world you were in. I don't believe. So the phraseology is not necessarily real world in many respects. I think it was something like you're cleared to start your engines, and real world it'd be something like Vision 2 Delta Whiskey startup approved. Call ground on 121 point something, whatever. It would not necessarily be in the same wording, but it's the same meaning, so we'll give a pass on that one, I guess. And so in terms of ATC phraseology, you're not going to be using this to learn it and then jump on the radios in a real plane, but I guess it does a decent enough job in this case with the ground handling. In flight, there didn't seem to be kind of centers as such. It was more like control areas based on airports. So I think there was one point where they were on East Midlands control because they were flying over East Midlands. So it's kind of similar to Eurofly 2, I guess, but it's a little bit more of an acknowledgement that there are actually control areas and designated airspace areas rather than just flying from airport to airport. Let's talk a little bit more about the ground layout then of some of these airports. So the gates didn't seem to be real world in terms of their name designations. but they are better. So there were gates labeled like 1, 2, 3, you know, that kind of thing, and it was fine. But you know, they weren't necessarily named as the real world counterparts would be. Heathrow, for example, had 5 gates and 5 stands, I believe. I can tell you right now, in real life, Heathrow has more than 10 parking spots and 10 gates or whatever. So, you know, this was not real world gates being used. However, yeah, there you go. One of the things I did like was you had to connect a jetway for the passengers to come on board. So you had to wait for the jetway to kind of connect up the steps. That was nice to see. The passengers, again, did board very quickly, similar to the fueling. But as I was talking about, you know, that's not uncommon even in the mainstream sims to have something like that happen, just to speed things up. Now the taxiway map, there were many more taxiways. I wasn't clear if they were real world designations. I don't think so, having looked at some maps and you know, being pretty familiar with yeah, so I looked at some of the charts that you can find and had them interpreted by Be My AI, and also, yeah, just being familiar with VATSIM, which is an online ACC network for the simulators. And some of the taxiways at Heathrow, for example, they didn't seem to be totally realistic in the layout. However, it felt more like an airport. You know, it was a much more significant route you had to take. It was not just taxiing down a kind of long strip as in Eurofly 2. So although it might not be totally realistic on taxiways, it's a lot more akin to what you would find, and I thought that was pretty good. The runways are realistic, so the lengths, the elevation, and the identifiers of the runways were real world, and that was very nice to see. It was very cool to see someone taking off from a real world runway and having to consider that runway's length and things in Eurofly. Let's talk a little bit now about the flight dynamics. Let's take a sip of the coffee. So the nose angle on takeoff is one thing. This is now relatively correct. So there are in the aircraft properties details about how much nose up pressure is going to be required, and how high you can put the nose before you are in danger of stalling. Essentially, minimum and maximum nose angles for takeoff. So that is very nice to see. I mean, obviously, again, it's a little bit binary, and it probably in the real world would change a bit depending on weight. However, it's a lot more realistic that if you can't just jam a 787 to 20 degrees nose up, or you know, whatever, and expect it's going to perform particularly well. It's probably going to struggle, might even stall if you're heavy, you know, things like that. So you've actually got to watch that. That's you know, I like that. And obviously, some aircraft do have unique situations in that you need a shallower climb because the aircraft is less powerful, or if it's a beast of an aircraft, that you can pitch up more and you've got that freedom. So having that there does add some specificity to each of the individual aircrafts. Again, same thing here, minimum and minimum takeoff and landing runway lengths. Again, a little bit binary. Probably there's, you know, in real life there's not really a set value for like, oh, this is the minimum, apart from in a lot of the manuals, and even then, you know, that they're often very conservative. But you know, it's there, it's modeled, and so that's really great to see that you can't just you know, get an A380 off of an airport that would not really have the runway to accommodate it anymore. So again, the flight dynamics, the proportionality between the engine power and speed seems to have been somewhat addressed. So you'll know kind of the whole way Eurofly 2 worked, where to increase your speed, you'll be infinitely increasing your engine power. You know, it didn't make much sense. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't proportional, right? Now the engines in Eurofly 3 are their own separate entity. So they have a max power, they have a minimum power, and where you put them will affect your speed, but the engines are not directly linked to, you can just continuously increase your engine power, and the speed is somehow linked, and then no, the engines are a separate entity. They have their own kind of ecosystem, and that impacts other parts of the flight. So that's nice to see. And it's really nice to see the impact of kind of banking taken into account. You can't overbank your aircraft ridiculously. We even saw the gentleman crash due to a stall because he was overbanking. So that's nice to see. Obviously, I'd have to look into more about kind of how realistic it is and whether it's oversensitive, undersensitive, and the physics of it. But it's really nice to see that taken into account, that you can't just spin an A380 180 degrees like nothing happened. And similarly, the forces on the flight controls are going to be required now. So, as before, you would just tap your arrow and they would start turning the aircraft at will. And now you actually have to hold the flight controls to keep holding them if you want to turn or whatever. And it's going to make a difference to the whole way you operate it. So that's kind of interesting, and nice to see that's being considered, rather than just kind of this very binary thing of, okay, I want to turn 180 degrees, I'm going to go tap tap and it's just going to move. Now you've actually got to apply the force and keep the thing turning if you want to keep banking. The engines have been modelled in a lot nicer way. The time to accelerate seems to be more realistic in a way. I could see the takeoff roll took quite a while, as it would for a heavy 787. And they just took a little bit longer to accelerate rather than being crazily responsive, and that should change depending on the aircraft. There was talk about this kind of engine gears system. I thought that was a little bit strange. I didn't really understand that. That doesn't really exist in the real world. The talk about kind of the percentage of power made a lot more sense. So you can there are shortcut keys to adjust the power by percentage. The engine taxi mode and flight mode is a little bit strange. Again, some aircraft do have this, but certainly not normally jets. Like, say, the 787 does not have a taxi mode that limits the engine's power. You can theoretically go full throttle on the ground on a taxiway on a 787 in the real world if you want, but I guess it's understandable to limit the engine's power. And yeah, I mean, it makes logical sense, right? It's just not something that's there in the real world in a lot of aircraft. Another thing is, I guess, about kind of cruise speeds. I did notice that the cruise speed never transitioned over to Mach. In the real world, at some point they're going to transition from indicated airspeed to Mach, which is obviously a percentage of the speed of sound. That never happened. It just stayed in kilometers per hour. So that was, that was unfortunate, I guess. Some of the properties seem to remain a little bit binary. I'm not sure. Again, I could be wrong, but there was, for example, a maximum altitude that the aircraft could reach. That just seemed to go straight up to the service ceiling. I would be curious to know if that will change depending on the aircraft's weight, because theoretically, for example, you could say, okay, well, this 787 can go up to 41,000 feet or 43 or whatever the surface ceiling is. Yes, it can, but only if it's very light. It would not be able to reach that altitude initially, and so you'd have to go in to the flight management computer and check what it can do. So whether that's been modeled, I'm not sure. So the stall modeling, this was quite nice to see. It does depend how much flap you have out, and you can stall the aircraft if you don't put them out. So in the 787 that Lucas was flying, at an empty weight, it seemed like his no flap stall speed was going to be 205 knots. I worked that out from what it was in the kilometers per hour that was given. I mean, yeah, that seems feasible, to be honest with you. Maybe a little bit high, to be honest with you, but relatively feasible. So yeah, I mean, it's nice to see that that's been modeled actually, and that you've got to pay attention to the flaps. That's the kind of knowledge that I'm talking about, that it's great for people to start learning these things, that you've got to watch your speed and put flaps out accordingly, and you can't just take off and immediately just retract your flaps because you will lose lift. So you noticed on the departure that he did, the flap retraction schedule was a lot slower. It wasn't just straight up, it was position by position, which is exactly like the real world. And the speed did seem to increase a lot more slowly, even on after the takeoff and on the departure, which is just like the real world, because an aircraft, departing, it takes quite a while to get up to speed. It was not just going to shoot up there like an overpowered spaceship. One thing I'll say, there was no mention of kind of speed restrictions. Obviously, like I said, standard instrument departures, things like that from the real world tend to have speed restrictions on them. And there is a general understanding that it's 250 knots below 10,000 feet. That did not seem to be implemented. You can just go straight up to maximum speed. You ram the engines forward and go to whatever it was, 900 and something kilometers per hour. That seems a bit odd. It might be nice if ATC could assign you a speed, especially keeping you at 250 knots below 10,000 feet. Another thing that was modelled was the reverse thrust system, so that was nice to see on landing. I'll skip past that one because, again, great to see, but I won't go into too much detail there. The landing physics seemed a little bit better, so you do have to idle the power on landing. I'm not entirely clear on what you're supposed to do with the nose of the aircraft. It sounded like he was saying that you should keep it level. In real life, you do idle the power, but you also arrest the aircraft's descent. So you kind of actually bring the nose up a little bit because you obviously want the aircraft to touch down on the back gears. You don't want the nose gear to touch down first, or kind of all at the same time. You kind of put the main gears down and then hold off the nose and then gently bring the nose down. But that didn't really seem to be there, but that's, let's talk a bit about ATC in flight, because there was a few other notes that I made. So it seems like they tried to model flight levels. So in the real world, there's a transition altitude where you go from altitude to flight levels. For example, in the US, it's 18,000, so flight level 180, and then you go up. So if you were cruising at 35,000, you'd be at flight level 350. They kind of tried to model it. So they said something like climb to 710, and what they were saying was, this is 7,100, and that's some kind of flight level. Not entirely how that works. It pretty much is that they probably wouldn't tell you to climb to 7,100. That would be a bit strange. Some of the altitudes that were given were a bit strange. They would try and keep it on even, or not even, but normally it's thousands of feet that they'll give you, and it'd be in feet, of course, not meters. Approach clearances that were given, it was just a runway assignment. So again, as I said, I don't want to go on about it too much. We know ATC is not the phraseology and stuff is not going to be perfect, but yeah, it was just pretty much you have been assigned runway whatever. Again, in the real world, they're going to give you a lot more details. They're going to probably they might say something like turn left heading 180, expect ILS approach runway 31 left. So they're telling you what approach to expect, and they're probably going to actually vector you. So it wouldn't just kind of be, oh, you're cleared for the approach. Normally, that can happen if it's a straight in or something, but normally they're going to vector you onto the ILS instrument landing system or some such other trajectory to go onto an approach. But there was no vectors included. There's nothing like that. Yeah. I think, I really need to I'd have to look into it a lot more in terms of how Eurofly 3 has it set up, but it did seem as though the approach kind of still wanted you to descend pretty low and then just kind of sit there and then put the aircraft down. You could descend pretty low. It was all kind of, this is the minimum safe altitude, so you can sit just above that. In real life, an approach they try and do is a kind of gradual, continuous descent, and they would never kind of be like, 10 miles from the airport, sat at 500 feet, just chilling there, and then when you get closer, just be like, oh, I'm going to now descend to the runway. It would be, you kind of have a gradual descent, or you'd be up in the kind of 3,000 feet range sitting there, and then you wait for the ILS glide slope to capture, and then you descend on the glide slope, and that'll be designed to give you a gradual descent down to the runway. So that seemed a little bit odd, but as I said, I mean, the fact that you've got things like minimum safe altitudes in there is pretty cool. Right, let's go on to the sounds. This is a really difficult one for me because I really do understand the limitations of the sound engines and that Eurofly will be using in comparison to Microsoft. But I can't unhear Microsoft right from again, I'm not attempting to compare. But for me, it's never going to be quite the same. So they are the sounds, put it this way, are miles better than before. They are way more dynamic, and they needed work. So I'm really glad that the work's taken place. Let me go through some observations I made just from the 787 that I heard. So the battery, it didn't sound like a 787 battery / avionics, kind of all the fans and everything. It sounded more like a GA aircraft. But again, okay. The APU sound actually wasn't too bad. I wouldn't say it sounded like a 787, but it sounded quite nice actually. I mean, you could definitely hear that it was firing up, and then you could hear the APU. Most switches, this was a really good point actually in my book. Most switches seem to have pretty nice sounds associated with them. Parking brakes and all the various system switches. Yeah, it was pretty decent. The engine start sounds, they were decent actually. Nothing special though. I mean, put it this way, my conclusion was if someone hadn't told me this was a 787, there's no way I would have known that it was a 787 by the sounds, right? Whereas in other simulators you would. They didn't sound particularly unique to a 787. They kind of sounded like generic jet. There wasn't kind of much bass to them, the really that you hear on an engine start. I mean, just watch a 787 and then watch that and tell me if they sound the same, because they don't. But again, I do understand the limitations, and the fact that a lot of these companies like Turbine Sound Studios have got real world recordings from real world aircraft. The worst sound was the braking sound. That really needs to be replaced. That was, like I said, I don't try and criticize too much, but that was, the brake sound was terrible. Got to get that out. I mean, I get there's got to be some sound there to tell you're braking, and obviously might not be in the real world. So it's nice to have some auditory version to let you know, and it's not necessarily going to be realistic. But that sound was just horrible. The passenger bustle sounds, they sounded pretty similar to Eurofly 2. Kind of sounded more like a pub than a plane, at least once all the passengers are boarded. But I mean, it's not the end of the world, and I'm sure people will make mods and things. Again, engine takeoff sounds, they weren't great. They didn't really sound like a 787. It kind of just sounded like some kind of, I mean, you could tell it was a jet of some sort, but I probably would have said it was like a private jet or something. I couldn't hear much roll as well on the takeoff and landing, so or I didn't really hear much touchdown sound. So I guess that could really be enhanced, the roll sound, to make it a lot more prominent, because when you get to high speeds in a heavy, you really will hear the roll. It sounded quite nice when you were in the air and sat at cruise, right? I mean, it sounded quite calming. It sounded nice. Again, didn't really sound like a 787, but it sounded nice. So I'm not saying that any of the sound design is necessarily bad at all. It just wasn't kind of. It didn't grab me as a 787. So again, that's just from the 787. There are other aircraft that I have heard some of the demos that were published on the mailing list from the sound designer, and some of the aircraft did sound very realistic. This one, I don't know. Again, it didn't sound bad, but it didn't sound like a 787. But I'm sure that's something that can be improved, and as I said, much better than Eurofly 2, right? I mean, it before was one file that just spooled up and down, right? I mean, it was really bad, and making mods for it was just painful back in the day. So yeah, I'm really glad that it's received some work, and I I think it's something that can be worked on, right? It could be the case that once the main bulk of everything has been done and Eurofly 3 is out there, that they say, okay, we're going to spend some time improving the sound for each aircraft. Okay, this is the 787 month where I'm going to work on the 787 and get it to sound like an actual 787. Get some real world recordings, or find out what I can use offline, and go about making it sound more realistic, right? So hopefully that'll happen, and then each aircraft can receive a bit of a makeover sound wise. But I mean, it was certainly serviceable, but it wasn't. It was nothing special, I would say. Some of the points that I picked up that I did like. There's going to be an interactive help system. I can imagine that took quite a while to make. So yeah, no, that looks really good. That you're going to be able to look up shortcut keys and things like that really easily. And of course, this wasn't demoed, but there is supposedly going to be multiplayer. So not only can you communicate, but you should be able to see other people's aircraft, right? That's going to be a big thing, I think, because whether Eurofly 3 you class it as realistic or in some cases unrealistic, it's always fun to fire up something and do something with your buddies. So if it's a flight, then that's fine, And there will be times, even for us mainstream simmers, I think, where maybe we say, we don't really want to fire up an in-depth simulation. Let's just take out a small aircraft and do a bit of a joyride, a bit of a free flight with a couple of people and just fly around and explore some of the terrain and try not to smash into things. And that could well be a use for it for those who are really involved with other mainstream sims. And then for those who are stepping up from Eurofly 2 to 3, I think it's going to help you gain so much knowledge, and it's going to bring a lot of joy and excitement, I guess. I mean, a lot of people are really wanting to learn more about aviation, and the systems of aircraft and the flight models of aircraft, but they either don't want to spend the time to get into the in-depth simulations, or maybe they just don't have the money. I mean, I have said that the funds that you need to get into something like Microsoft have come down dramatically, and I do believe they have, but you still probably need 100, 200 quid to get started. Maybe someone just doesn't want to invest that into simming, and so they just stick with Eurofly, and if so, then I think you're going to love Eurofly 3. So I hope this has been useful. I know it sounds like I'm nitpicking and I'm just pointing out this is wrong, this is wrong. I don't think anything in particular is wrong per se. It's more just an interpretation of it, and it's not always going to be spot on. But there are definitely positives, definitely things that I like about it. Am I going to try it? Yeah, probably. I'll get hold of it, and I'm sure people want to see it. They want to have a bit of fun with it, and it adds a bit of variety. It's something else. So yeah, I'm glad to see the project coming to a close, to fruition, and I know that a lot of people have put a lot of time into it, so I'm glad that their efforts are going to be rewarded with this. And yeah, I hope that, given that it seems as though the Eurofly team has expanded a little bit, I mean, for example, they've got the sound designer. I forget the name, unfortunately, but yeah, they have a sound designer now. So things like that are going to allow people to actually, once everything's stable and Eurofly 3 has been released, to then dedicate more time to their area and make improvements. So that can only be a good thing, right? So as long as you approach this with the right attitude, then I think you're going to like it. As I know, as a mainstream simmer from MSFS and stuff, it can be difficult to maybe take some of it seriously, or to kind of go back to it. It can be, I used the metaphor before of for some of us, it's like going from a Ferrari to a toy car. Well, I think Eurofly 3 is going to push it to maybe going from a Ferrari to a Toyota Camry or something like that. So it's going to be the drop in realism is hopefully going to be a little bit less. It's still going to be there, absolutely, and that's undeniable, but it's going to be a little bit less, and hopefully that means also that the step from something like Eurofly to other simulators will help, will become smaller, and will help people make that step a little bit easier. with more knowledge about, if maybe not aircraft systems in terms of specific aircraft and system depth, but at least learn more about kind of the flight model of aircraft, the ways in which that they handle, and stimulate the passion for aviation as well. So yeah, I think it can only be a good thing. All right, well, I hope this was useful, and as more stuff gets released, I may well make more videos, or most likely I will give it a go at some point when it actually gets released.